welcome back to the channel. This is Nerd World. Today an exploration of something I mentioned in a previous video and I've been meaning to cover, but it's a difficult subject to cover because there isn't much canon, so this video is going to be a bit more discussion and even include possibly a little bit of beta canon information, and that is on the often mentioned, seldom seen, but occasionally seen Starfleet Marines. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below for more content like this on Star Trek and other science fiction franchises, and also check out in the description below links to my various different social medias and other channels that are of course linked in the description. With that said, let's get started on the Starfleet Marines. Okay, now as I said, the Marines are occasionally seen and mentioned but not fully explored. They were originally out of universe, meant to be part of the crew of the original USS Enterprise, but due to budget reasons were never aboard. But Gene Roddenberry had always intended for Starfleet to have this sort of military adjacent. Starfleet is not a strictly military organization, and as I previously stated, the form of warfare for humanity has evolved over the centuries. However, there is still sometimes a need for blunt force rather than diplomacy. And as a result, Starfleet security, who are obviously not equipped for dangerous tactical assignments really compared to many of the more militaristic species such as the Jem'Hadar, the Cardassians, the Breen, Romulans, Borg, etc., a more specialized unit was always needed. Now in the 22nd century, and in for that matter the 21st century, there were the MACOs. But the MACOs, although they were in use and as an operational division during the Earth-Romulan War, at the official formation of the Federation, they will be integrated into Starfleet. Now this is where we've got to make some suppositions about the Starfleet Marines. It's reasonable to assume that if Starfleet of the 2150s had the Marine Corps, Archer wouldn't have bothered having military personnel aboard his ship, he would have had Marines. The Marines, although they do actually operate more like Marines are meant to in the US Navy or the British Navy now, in that they are more than just ship security, they're trained for boarding action and direct combat assignments, they would have been the better choice for Archer, I believe, at that time if they had existed, so we can only assume they didn't exist. Now, in a command structure sense, they do answer, from what we can tell, to Starfleet Command like other branches of Starfleet, but similar, as we know, Starfleet is divided into different branches such as Starfleet Medical, Starfleet Intelligence, Starfleet proper is in its fleet, but they have a completely different command structure based more on that of old Earth military organizations such as an army, the general United States military in general, with everything from colonels and generals down to the lowly ranks of a private or enlisted personnel. So and at the top I believe they have marshals, but there's very little of them ever explored, so we can assume the numbers are generally quite small. Now they did appear and were featured heavily in the old FASA playing game, where they would do things like engage Orion pirates and undertake combat missions against anti-Federation Orion personnel and destroying bases. They were also slated to be used in the extraction of Dr. McCoy and Captain Kirk from Rura Penthe, but obviously that mission was ultimately done by the USS Enterprise instead. There were, of course, Marines aboard the ship that were going to be deployed. That's one of the few instances where we actually see Marines more than just Starfleet security, those heavily armed troops. Now we know that armor and heavy weapons were available to Starfleet personnel in general, but their training with them was more limited. As you see, on the average away team in the 23rd and 24th and 22nd century, for that matter, going back a little further, the average Starfleet away team only carry a tricorder and a phase pistol at best, very rarely carrying anything like a grenade or a phaser rifle or anything else of that nature, although we do see these weapons are available aboard starships. Now whether or not the Galaxy class USS Enterprise had them, but we know ships like the Sovereign class, which was more of a combat ship, did carry anti-aircraft weapons, surface-to-air weaponry, as well as its standard phaser compression rifles and other weapons that could be carried by the crew, not to mention having craft like the Argo on board. So there was definitely at least the facility for these weapons, but there was also this adjacent military structure. Now again, going back, when the Makos were properly dissolved, forgetting other beta canon sources that say they come back in the late 24th century, which to be honest I think would be a brilliant idea, and I think the Federation does need them. And of course within the Federation there are other pseudo-military organizations such as the Dorian Imperial Guard. And forget all that stuff about how they get absorbed into Starfleet. Shows like Lower Decks have proven that actually the naval forces and structures of the fleet-based systems used by the various races that join the Federation do remain in operation on some level. So they're not just erased and absorbed into Starfleet as is sometimes mentioned, although they may be answerable to it, not entirely sure. It's always a little vague. The inner politics of the Federation are surprisingly not well explored. But again, getting back to the Marines, we can assume that when the Makos were dissolved, that they were absorbed into Starfleet. We know this from the events of Star Trek Beyond. We know that from the crew of the USS Franklin. They were, many of them, former Makos. Especially the ship's captain, Captain Edson. So, yeah, we know they were absorbed. But the Makos were a huge number at that time. Obviously many of them just became regular serving Starfleet personnel. Others would have simply retired. But we can assume that it was around this time that Starfleet realised it probably still needed a paramilitary force of some description, and maybe many of those Makos became the first wave of Starfleet Marines. In my head canon, that's what makes most sense. Give me in the description below if you have an alternative theory, because I'm open to them, because again, the murky origins of the Starfleet Marines are a little vague. I believe they do exist and are probably part of the Starfleet Charter for the Federation, rather than the Starfleet that existed prior to the Federation. I don't think Starfleet, from just the Earth Starfleet, had the Marines. I think they were an addition, or tacked on, when the Federation was formed as a means of utilising those military forces of the Makos and their advanced training. Through the 23rd century, we know from FASA, if we take it as canon, and some of it's never been contradicted, so we probably can, that they were still in use and deployed regularly and in numbers against the Federation's enemies, such as the Klingons, the Orions, the Romulans, and others. By the 24th century, the Marines do still exist. They've never been disbanded. The only evidence you ever see of a Marine is in a single battle taking place during the Dominion War, when you see Marines in operation. Now, you could argue that these are Starfleet security personnel who are simply utilising heavier ordnance and a bit of body armour. It's possible. It's entirely possible. It's also possible that Marines serve aboard ships in secondary capacities until they're actually needed. That also makes some degree of sense. Or they've been more integrated by the 24th century and are more like an advanced elite force, to reference the game, unit of Starfleet security. But my guess would be the Marines still exist, and they're just very limited in number compared to the 23rd century, and that's certainly about from the 22nd century, where I bet there were millions of them. I bet their numbers have dwindled into the numbers of tens of, if not just hundreds of thousands maximum, within the entire Federation. So that's probably one of the reasons we see them very sparingly. As for any ships, there are references here and there. They have fighters, fighter carriers, and other ships which are utilised specifically by the Starfleet Marines, such as the Typhon class, which is probably utilised or crewed heavily by Starfleet Marine personnel. But these are all beta canon, and there are many fan designs out there that are excellent and make a lot of sense, and it makes sense as Marines are more than just soldiers. Marines are not soldiers in the sense of you understand them. Marines do a variety of other jobs, and it would make sense that in a space navy of the 24th century they would have a much more broad role than simply being soldiers. So they would have done other duties aboard ship, and also would probably have been very accomplished pilots. I think a good comparison would be the other sci-fi franchise, Space Above and Beyond, where the pilots in that are not Air Force, they're Marines. So they pilot fighters as well as work on infantry missions on the ground. And I think you would see something very similar in Starfleet. There would be a sort of hybrid somewhere between the two. They would do ground-based warfare. They would do advanced hand-to-hand combat. They likely would have carried a standard issue, heavier armor, possibly personal shields. They would have carried heavy ordnance, explosives, a much more integrated mechanical suit and weapons, which worked more hand in hand. The battlefield integration just of the 21st century is incredible, so you can imagine what kind of tech they're probably using in the 24th century. You're probably looking at a fully integrated one-to-one battlefield where all the troops have first communication with one another, instantaneous. There's very likely very quick transfer of information, sharing of data just between the suits. You can imagine the kind of heads-up displays they probably have. They probably have tricorders built into their helmets. Again, all speculation, but it makes sense. It makes sense that they would have had some kind of automated targeting system built into their weapon systems rather than a standard Starfleet phaser, as we know, may have some of the rifles have targeting lenses, things like that on them, but we know that you can easily integrate a sort of small tricorder, so you could put a bioscanner into the weapon and have it so you could scan the battlefield and know how many enemy opponents you've got, try and scan for Jem'Hadar that are shrouded. Again, all speculation, but it's fun to speculate. It makes sense, that especially by the 24th century, but as I said, there's such sparing information on them. One of the few members of the organization we do know anything about would be Colonel Patrick West, played by the late Rene Auberjonois in one of his Star Trek outings early on in his career. He was actually a Federation traitor, but we see that he answered to the Federation President and to Starfleet Command, and he worked with General Chang and others to conspire to destabilize the peace between the Federation and the Klingons, wanting war, basically believing the Federation should dominate the Klingons, not simply look for a peaceful resolution. Now, he was clearly wrong, as the Federation and the Klingons would go on to have a prosperous and mutually beneficial and ultimately life-saving alliance between the two powers, but you can maybe see his perspective on it. They've been at odds with the Klingons for a very long time. As Kirk put it, let them die. That sentiment was pretty ubiquitous throughout Starfleet at the time. Colonel West was ultimately killed while impersonating a Klingon officer attempting to assassinate the Federation president at the time. Now, he is not a good example of a Starfleet Marine. He is a traitor and a bad man, but all the same, he was definitely a member of the Marines, and was probably the one that put those Marines aboard the USS Enterprise for its mission to meet up with the IKS Kronos 1. It's also reasonable to assume that maybe he hand-picked certain officers to send to that ship. We know that it was humans that ultimately assassinated Chancellor Gorkon. He may have put people in place that maybe he hadn't personally recruited, but maybe he evaluated as could be swayed to do the mission, to go on the assassination run. Again, speculation, but it's plausible, especially when you're talking about conspiracies. So there we have a basic overview. Now, as I said, there's so little information, I can't really give anything concrete. So the Marines, there's something we can speculate about and talk about, but there's still plenty of room within the lore and within any of the series that are currently on to explore a more detailed look at this somewhat unknown organization from within Starfleet. Now, in fairness, a lot of organizations in Starfleet are not heavily explored. Section 31, for example, is not a heavily explored agency for good reason, but neither is Starfleet Intelligence. And to be honest, we don't know the ins and outs of how exactly Starfleet Medical operates as an autonomous unit within the Federation. We don't. We know that they are probably the ones that are actually in control of ships like the Olympic-class starships, but are they? It's a little vague. So there's so much potential storytelling, and their existence makes a lot of sense, even if they are only in limited numbers. Just having them gives you that flexibility. It gives you the fist, it gives you the stick when the carrot doesn't work. And they're a good defensive wing if Earth's ever invaded. You can imagine, it's reasonable to assume that the Starfleet Marines headquarters will be on Earth, just like Starfleet Command is. It would make sense. Their main training bases are probably at least within the Sol system, or close to it. Probably on Earth itself, but who knows? Again, we don't know. It's probable facilities like West Point and other such bases are still in operation, and simply have had a continuation of service. I'd like to believe that, because it makes sense. If something's good, why get rid of it? We know that Fort Knox is still in use in the 24th century, so why not? So, as I said, that brings us to the end. If you think of anything that I have missed, as I said, I know they are referenced in FASA, and I've not really gone into much about them in FASA here. That's mostly because I've not played FASA, but I do know bits and pieces of that lore, but being beta canon, it's something I tend to shy away from. But if you want to share anything in the comments below to explore more about them, feel free to do so. And that was the Starfleet Marines, at least what limited information we know about them. It's pretty much the only named character and member of their personnel we really truly know about. I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.